Picture a Roman legionary packed tight into a shield wall. Death is everywhere. It could be a Parthian arrow, a Gallic axe, or a fellow Roman sword in one of the endless civil wars. To sign up for the Roman army was to accept a level of suffering that would break most people today. There was no rest. The moment they arrived, the soldiers had to build a fortified camp, a task they performed every single night. They'd dig a deep ditch, build a rampart from the earth, and plant their stakes on top to create a defensive wall. A whole legion could build a secure camp in just a few hours a feat of both incredible discipline and utter exhaustion. The vitus was the centurion's go-to tool for everyday discipline. For any small mistica dirty piece of gear, a second's hesitation in a drill, looking like you weren't trying hard enough, a soldier could expect a fast, painful smack from the vine staff. This was so common, it was just called castigatio, routine correction. This wasn't even a formal punishment, it was just casual violence, a constant physical reminder of who was in charge. A soldier could be struck in front of his friends for the tiniest error, a stinging blow that was as much about humiliation as it was about pain. Some centurions got famous for how much they used the staff, earning nicknames like Cedo Alteram, which meant "bring me another," because they'd break their staffs on their soldiers' backs and immediately call for a replacement. This wasn't optional. It was survival. A soldier could never really relax. He was always under the centurion's watch, knowing one wrong move could bring instant, painful results. This daily low-level brutality was the foundation of Roman discipline. It trained the soldier to obey orders without a single thought knot from patriotism, but from a raw fear of the man holding the vine staff. Before a soldier could even think about disobeying or running, the memory of the vitus was right there to stop him. Being caught unprepared during camp construction was an offense that could get you severely punished, maybe even killed, because it put everyone at risk. Training was just as brutal. Recruits went through 4 months of conditioning hell. They were drilled relentlessly in marching, instant obedience, and weapon mastery. This was often done with wooden swords and shields that were deliberately heavier than the real things, all to build the strength needed for real, prolonged combat. They swam, they ran, they did gymnastics. Every single activity was about building peak physical endurance. It was a life of non-stop physical hardship, deliberately designed to grind away civilian softness and forge a man into a living weapon. On campaign, 8 men shared a single cramped leather tent. The contubernium, which offered little protection and zero privacy. He was the backbone of the Roman army, the crucial link between the generals and the grunts. Centurions weren't aristocrats who were handed their command. They were almost always veteran soldiers who had clawed their way up through the ranks. They'd earned their spot with bravery, skill, and an unshakable ability to command. They were tough, experienced, and battle-hardened, and they demanded total obedience from the men in their century. A centurion was a figure of both respect and pure fear. In battle, he led from the front, taking the most dangerous position on the right end of the line. But in the camp and on the march, his main job was to enforce discipline, the iron code of the legions. To do this, he had immense authority, including the power to dish out punishments on the spot. Their diet was boring and barely nutritious, mostly wheat or bread, with very little meat or fresh vegetables. This constant physical stress and poor nutrition created a permanent state of misery. This was the legionaries' normal life, a world of endless marches, back-breaking labor, and cramped, uncomfortable living. It was a world where every day was already a struggle. So against that backdrop of institutionalized hardship, what could possibly be worse? The centurion had an answer. The most basic reality of this life, the march. Legionaries were expected to cover 20 miles a day or more, not on a nice paved road, but over rough terrain, in blistering heat or freezing rain. And they did this carrying a shocking amount of weight. Their armor, shield, javelins, and sword were just the start. They also had to carry entrenching tools like a shovel or pickaxe, a saw, a basket for moving dirt, 2 heavy stakes for the camp's wall, and days' worth of grain. All told, a soldier's pack could weigh over 44 pounds a constant, grinding weight on his shoulders and back. The enemy is a real, terrifying, chaotic wave of violence threatening to crash down on him at any second. And yet, for many soldiers, the biggest danger, the most immediate, persistent source of pure terror, wasn't the screaming warrior in front of him. It was the man standing behind him. That man was a professional soldier, a career officer. And for the 80 men under his command, he was the absolute master of life and death. He was the centurion, the unwritten law of the legions, the philosophy that hammered out an empire. It's brutally simple. You will fear your centurion far more than you will ever fear the enemy. Why? Because fear of the enemy might make you hesitate. But fear of your centurion would make you advance into the jaws of death without a second thought. This isn't just a story about glory on the battlefield. This is a story about the calculated, systematic brutality that perfected the Roman war machina system of discipline, where the ultimate threat was unto foreign enemy, but the wrath of your own commander. So, to really get why these punishments were so terrifying, you first have to understand what life was normally like for a Roman soldier. And the day's work wasn't over when the marching stopped. Their living conditions were grim. At the very heart of this system of discipline stood the centurion. His symbol of office, as famous as his sideways crested helmet, was the vitusa simple staff made from a grapevine. This wasn't for show. The ever-present threat of the vitus created a climate of constant anxiety. For a Roman soldier honoror, dignitas was everything. It was tied to his reputation, his place among his peers, and his very sense of self. The Roman command knew that while physical pain was effective, one of the best ways to control a soldier was to attack his honor. Public humiliation was a weapon, and the centurion wielded it with surgical precision to enforce the rules and punish anyone who stepped out of line. These punishments weren't just meant to hurt the body, they were meant to break the spirit. One of the most common ways to do this was by messing with the rations. Legionary staple food was wheat, a symbol of his status as a proper Roman soldier. By stripping away a man's honor, a centurion could break his will far more effectively than with a simple beating. For the most serious individual crimes offenses that threatened the safety of the entire unit, the punishment had to be absolute. The most common was falling asleep on guard duty. In hostile territory, one sleeping sentry could get the entire camp massacred. The condemned man was brought before the assembled troops. The centurion would lightly touch the soldier with his staff. That was the signal. The soldiers were made part of the system of discipline. They weren't just watching justice happen. They were the violent tools of it. This made it much harder to resent the commanders. The very word, from the Latin decimation, meaning the removal of a tenth, is now a synonym for mass slaughter. This was the ultimate punishment, a form of collective discipline saved for the most catastrophic failures: mass cowardice, large-scale mutiny, or an entire unit deserting. When a unit had failed so badly that its honor was gone, the command could turn to this terrifying lottery of death. How could you blame the centurion when you were the one holding the club? It purged the unit of the offender while brutally reinforcing the logic of Roman discipline in the minds of everyone who survived. In that instant, the man's own comrades, the men from his tent, his cohort, the men he'd marched and fought beside, would swarm him. He was, however, condemned to exile for life, a fate some considered worse than death. The fustuarium was the ultimate expression of the legion's internal justice. It showed in the most graphic way possible that the biggest threat to a soldier's life wasn't the enemy, but a failure to do his duty to his comrades, failure they, under the unblinking eye of their centurion, would make him pay for. Armed with heavy wooden clubs, fusts, and stones, they would beat him to death. The true horror of the fustuarium isn't just in the violence, but in the psychology. The officers didn't execute the man themselves, forced his own friends to be his executioners. This did a few things. First, it was a horrifying deterrent. Every soldier watching and participating knew this could be his fate. The visceral, bloody act of killing a comrade would be burned into his memory forever. Other capital offenses included desertion, lying in a military trial, stealing from a comrade inside the camp, or directly disobeying a critical order. These weren't just mistakes. They were acts of betrayal that put every single man's life in danger. It had to be so terrifying that no soldier would ever even think of committing the crime. This was the fustuarium, or death by clubbing. The fear of public shame, of being seen as less than a man by your brothers in arms, was a powerful tool that kept soldiers in line and reinforced the rigid, brutal hierarchy of the legion. A soldier might be put on latrine duty or other menial tasks considered beneath a legionary. This set him apart from his friends and marked him as a failure. For minor offenses, or to punish a whole unit that messed up, a centurion could order the men's rations to be switched from wheat to barley. A soldier could be ordered to stand guard for hours in front of the commander's tent, making a public spectacle of his shame. In worse cases, he could be forced to do it without his military belt cingulum, a key part of his uniform and a symbol of his status as a soldier. Being seen without it was like being stripped of your rank, a powerful symbol of emasculation. To us, that might seem small, but to a Roman, it was a huge insult. This was a punishment with both real and psychological teeth. It stripped them of the camp's safety, leaving them exposed to weather and enemy raids. But more than that, it was a form of exile. It physically and symbolically cast them out, branding the whole unit as untrustworthy and disgraced in front of the entire army. Barley was seen as food for animals, and forcing a soldier to eat it was like publicly demoting him, telling him he was no better than livestock. It was a daily, visible reminder of his disgrace that he had to swallow in front of all his comrades. Another punishment aimed straight at a soldier's pride was being forced to do extra, demeaning jobs known as munerarum indictio. Even more humiliating were punishments that changed how a soldier looked or where he stood in camp. For entire units that had shown cowardice, they could be forced to camp extramuros outside the fortified walls of the main camp. These punishments were a form of calculated psychological warfare. They hammered home the idea that a soldier's worth was tied directly to his obedience. As we climb the ladder of Roman military justice, we enter a world of sanctioned brutality that is hard to even imagine today. The crimes that earned you the fustuarium were those that broke the sacred trust between soldiers. When a soldier was found guilty, the sentence was carried out with a chilling ritual. Second, it created a powerful, shared sense of responsibility. If, by some miracle, the condemned man escaped the storm of blows and fled the camp, he wasn't chased. Of all the punishments in the Roman army's playbook, none is as infamous or as chilling as decimation. The procedure was a masterpiece of cold, mathematical terror. The disgraced unit, usually a cohort of around 480 men, would be assembled. Their unlucky comrade, a man guilty of nothing more than being in a failed unit and having bad luck, was beaten or stoned to death by the very men he called his brothers. The centurions oversaw the whole grim affair, making sure the sentence was carried out. They were divided into groups of 10. Inside each group, the 10 soldiersmen who had lived, fought, and marched side by side had to draw lots. It was built on a foundation of carefully engineered and relentlessly applied fear. And who would oversee the brutal execution of your friends if your unit failed? The enemy might kill you. Your centurion would see you killed, often in the most shameful way possible, if you faltered. This brutal internal logic is what held the legions together. It's what made them push forward when it seemed impossible. It's what made them stand their ground when every instinct screamed to run. An army that feared its own officers more than the enemy was an army that would not break. The glory of Rome wasn't won in spite of this brutality. It was forged in its fires under the watchful, unforgiving eye of the centurion. The punishments he delivered weren't random acts of cruelty. They were a calculated system designed to perfect men into unflinching instruments of war. Which punishment do you think was the most terrifying, and why? Let us know in the comments below. They targeted a soldier's body, his honor, and his bond with his comrades. When a legionary stood in the shield wall, he was trapped between two terrors. In front of him was the enemy, a chaotic and violent threat. But behind him stood the centurion, the face of a much more certain, systematic, and inescapable danger. They might pull marked pebbles from a helmet. The method didn't matter, only the result. For 9 of the men, the lot meant life. For the 10th, it was a death sentence. The 9 survivors were then forced to carry out the execution. One of the most famous uses of decimation was by Marcus Licinius Crassus. During his war against Tacitus' slave rebellion in 71 BCE, after some of his legions broke and ran from a battle, Crassus, needing to restore discipline, revived the ancient and brutal punishment. He forced the disgraced units to undergo decimation, sending a terrifying message that he wouldn't tolerate any weakness. They were forced to sleep outside the main camp and had their rations switched to humiliating barley. They were treated like outcasts until they could redeem themselves in blood and victory. Decimation was rare, precisely because it was so extreme. But the fact that it could happen, the knowledge that the command was capable of it, was a constant looming shadow over every legionary. It was the final, terrifying proof that in the Roman army, the individual was nothing and the discipline of the whole was everything. The act is said to have hardened the resolve of his army, which went on to defeat Spartacus. The psychological impact of decimation was devastating. For the survivors, it was a storm of trauma. First, the incredible relief of surviving, immediately followed by the horror and guilt of murdering a friend. It violently shattered the bonds of trust and replaced them with a shared nightmare. It sent a clear message. The unit is responsible for every one of its members. If the line breaks, everyone pays. This created a ruthless kind of self-policing where soldiers would pressure each other to hold firm. Knowing the alternative wasn't just death from the enemy, but a lottery of death from their friends. The remaining soldiers of the decimated unit were shamed further. The Roman war machine, the force that conquered and held an empire for centuries, wasn't built on courage alone. The centurion was the living embodiment of Roman discipline. He was the man who'd beat you with a vine staff for a small mistake, who'd shame you with barley rations. The whole system was designed to make sure that a soldier's fear of his own command would always be greater than his fear of the enemy. The punishments of the Roman army were designed to attack a soldier in different ways physically, socially, and psychologically.
Clear.
And if you want to uncover more of the brutal realities behind the great empires of history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content.